Hi, I'm Eric Patashnik, the director of the Master's of Public Affairs program at the Watson Institute for International Public Affairs at Brown University. I'm pleased today to be speaking to my colleague, John Friedman. John is a professor of economics and international public affairs at the Watson Institute, as well as co-director of Opportunity Insights. So thanks so much for joining me today, John.
It's great to be with you, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Great. So, John, I understand that you and your colleagues have created an innovative tool that uses real-time data collected from private businesses to measure the depth of the economic downturn during the COVID-19 pandemic. So first, what led you to create this tool? Why aren't existing data sources, surveys collected from businesses and households, why aren't they adequate to gauge the state of the economy today?
So the traditional way, exactly as you mentioned, of measuring how the economy is doing are government surveys, which are highly scientifically accurate. They're done on a representative sample. The problem is that they take quite a while to come out. So just to give you two examples, we've just learned from the employment situation report from the Labor Department that unemployment is now up over 14% in the US and 20.5 million jobs were lost in the last month. The problem is that that was conducted using a survey during the week ending April 12th. And so that information is nearly a month old at this point. And in normal times, getting information that's a little bit out of date, I think, is not that big of a deal. But the economy is evolving so fast these days. There's a lot that's happened in the last month. So for instance, on the good side, we've seen stimulus payments go out. And so we hope that's had a positive effect on the economy. Lots of small business loans have gone out. We hope that's had a positive effect on the economy. But on the other hand, the pandemic has continued to grow in many places in a way that maybe wasn't expected at that time. And we know from unemployment claims that another 11 million people have filed for unemployment since that Labor Department survey was created. And so I think, if there's one thing we've learned in this crisis, it's that we can't afford to fall behind the curve on information. We need to be making decisions based on the most up-to-date news. This was a big problem at the beginning of the crisis where we didn't really understand what was going on in real time from a health perspective. And we want to make sure that from an economic perspective, we are making decisions based on the best possible information available.
So can you say a little bit more about how the tool works? What are some of the variables that you show in the tool? How did you pull together these data elements? Talk us through how this actually works.
So I think it's worth taking a step back and just asking first, where is this information that's kind of real time coming from, right? If we can do better than this month-old government survey, what is it? And I think the answer is that a lot of different firms that participate in financial transactions, that are financial intermediaries, that are payroll processors, they're seeing in real time what's going on in the economy. And so, if I go out to Stop and Shop and buy some groceries this morning, the credit card company is going to know immediately that I've made that purchase because they have to charge it to my account. And then we're not seeing anybody's individual purchases, but once you anonymize and aggregate up those data, you get a pretty good real-time sense of what's going on. And so we're getting data from kind of aggregated credit card purchases, which is really only about 4 or 5 days old. And as you know from your credit card statement, that's just the amount of time that it takes basically to finalize all the charges that have happened. And similarly, on the employment side, the Bureau of Labor Statistics number, that's from a month ago, but lots of people are getting paid today as on payday, and all the payroll processing firms that help all the large and small businesses pay their employees, they know what the employment situation is, not just a month ago, but today. And so what we did is we reached out to a group of these firms who we thought had information that was well placed to help provide data on the economy and helped aggregate that information. We did, I think, two things in order to really make this possible. One is that we've brought together lots of different data sources for single variables. So sometimes companies don't want to just put out all of their data that's only about their company because they're worried that it'll reveal something about, what their business model is or where they have a lot of exposure to risk. they might be worried about that. But if we can combine data from lots of different financial intermediaries, then I think we can get in fact, a much more accurate picture of the economy, but we actually don't reveal anything that's potentially sensitive about any individual firm's business. So that's the one, I think, key to what we're doing, is that we can combine data sources for any given variable. The other key is that we can combine different variables measuring what's going on in the economy from different perspectives. And I think that's another advantage of what we're doing. So let me just give you an example of that. When we think about credit card transactions, one way you can think about it is from the consumer perspective. How much are individuals in Providence or in New York spending on any given day? But another way you can think about it is from the merchant perspective. How much revenue is going to businesses, and especially I think small businesses are the ones which we're really concerned about here. How much is being spent at small businesses in Providence or in New York? And of course, residents in Providence may be spending money at Providence businesses, but those two are going to be different things, because residents in Providence may be spending money at large businesses in Providence. They may be spending money on Amazon instead. And so, just right there, we can see two different perspectives on the economy that something like the unemployment rate is going to miss. Another advantage is that we can disaggregate these data across cities and states and counties so that you can really get a localized picture of what's going on. The government surveys also can do that, but there's kind of a rule, which is that the more disaggregated you want to be, the longer the lag is in the information. And so we're learning something about unemployment rates at the state level today. But if you want to learn something more about consumer spending or about more detailed information about, say, industrial breakdowns of unemployment rates or spending, then you're going to have to wait for a thing called the quarterly census of employment and wages. And as it sounds like, that only comes out every quarter. And so we're going to get that in a few months, but that's only going to tell us about the first quarter of 2020. It's going to be until the summer until we learn about what's happening now. And I think that kind of delay is really unacceptable, given that we have this new information available.
So I'm trying to get a sense of sort of the scale and scope of your data set. Can you give us a sense of how many millions of observations are in your data, and also what percentage, say, of overall consumer spending are you able to capture with your data set?
Yeah, so at the moment, our best guess is that we're able to capture about 10% of consumer spending. So it accounts to tens of billions of dollars of transactions every month. But we are actually adding new data partners every week. And that both allows us to measure variables that we currently have in better and more representative, more granular ways. But it also allows us to provide new looks at the data. As you know, I think as academics, sometimes there's the instinct to hold on to something and you just perfect that analysis until it's absolutely perfect. But I think that this situation demanded that we actually get something out so long as we thought that there was a lot of information and it was useful. And so this is kind of just the start of this tracker that we're building. And as you'll see over the next month, we're going to be able to add quite a bit to it.
Right. So I'm curious, what's your sense of what led the private companies to want to share the data? Do you see this on their part as they're contributing to a public good, national welfare, better policy, or do you think they themselves believe that this tool will help them make better decisions for their own companies?
I think it's mostly about contributing to a public good. I think that we've been very impressed, and it's been wonderful to see so much energy from private sector companies being willing to share data and do things in ways that they've really never been able to do before. And I think part of it is that they're in a very public-minded spirit at the moment, but part of it is that they see that there's a great need for this in a way that maybe there wasn't a need 6 months ago. And so I think necessity is the mother of invention, and this crisis and impetus to do this has helped us to work with those companies to overcome and figure out how to work around some of the barriers that may have been existing in the past. And so I think it's both the public spiritedness, and now that we're actually focused on this problem, we can kind of figure out a way to make it work, maybe in a way that it wasn't immediately obvious how to do that, just because people weren't thinking about it as hard before.
So what do you see as some of the key takeaway lessons from the data? How are your results or findings going to help public officials make better decisions as they try to steer the economy back into recovery?
Sure. So I think the first thing is just to understand what's happened.
Mhm.
And, we talk about the, roughly month lag since the survey for the employment report that came out. I think one of the most important policies that, it was essentially implemented since then was the stimulus. And so this chart that you can see here, this is an example of the type of thing you can see on our economic tracker. First, this is just showing national trend lines in total consumer spending. And what you see, I think, very dramatic. When the crisis hit in mid-March, consumer spending fell off very rapidly, and it did so very quickly, such that by the beginning of April, just 2 weeks later, it had fallen by somewhere between 30 and 35%. But right after the stimulus payments started on around April 13th, you start to see a pretty strong recovery. Now, I don't want to oversell this, because instead of being down 30 to 35%, now we're down more like 20% nationally, and that's still an enormous hit to consumer spending. But on the other hand, being down 20% is a lot better than being down 30 to 35%. And so I think one of the first things that has just leapt off the page at us is that the stimulus payments do seem to have really made a very strong impact in raising the total level of consumer spending.
That's great. And of course, this economic shock is affecting the whole country. But my sense, I think, is that different parts of the country may be experiencing a steeper downturn than others. Is your data able to show those regional or geographical effects? What are you finding about what communities are really bearing the brunt of this, and which ones are doing a little bit better?
Yeah, we're finding a ton of heterogeneity across the country in how the economic crisis is playing out. And in some sense, I think that's not surprising, because, as you know, the health crisis has been very different in lots of different places. But I think what's interesting that we're finding is that the magnitude of the economic shock doesn't necessarily track the magnitude of the health shock. So let me give you a few examples. So here's one chart, which just takes that total consumer spending line that I showed you before, and just shows you the specific trend lines in 3 states across the country: in West Virginia, in Rhode Island, and in Washington, D.C. And so what you see is really 3 very different pictures. Of course, all of these states were affected very sharply at the beginning of the recession. But what we've seen, for instance, in West Virginia, is that there's been a very strong bounce back, especially following the stimulus payments. So West Virginia was down about 25% at the beginning of April, but they actually rebounded such that at the end of April, they were actually very close to where they were before the crisis hit, if not even above for a small period after the stimulus. In Washington, D.C., we're seeing a much different picture. Things are down by 50% relative to not only where they were before the crisis, but what we would have expected based on last year. And so just to unpack that a little bit, spending has fallen quite a bit since early March, but Washington, D.C. is a place where spending actually goes up when you go into the spring. As people want to go outside, there's the Cherry Blossom Festival. This should be a time that's really booming for Washington, D.C. And instead of being up like it was last year, we're actually down. And so putting those 2 things together, the hit in Washington has not only been much larger than in these other states, but you've also not seen the same level of recovery that we have, especially in a place like West Virginia. But even as you see in Rhode Island, we've seen kind of a partial recovery. The time pattern has been a little bit different here. Rhode Island was initially one of the harder hit states, and it took a little while longer for the stimulus payments to kind of kick into effect here. I'm not totally sure why. And so we've recently recovered a little bit, but still we're below the national average. And I think this is the type of localized information that we need to get into the hands of policymakers when Governor Raimondo is trying to understand what does this state need and what can her administration do in order to support citizens and support businesses through the crisis. Learning that things are fine in West Virginia and really bad in Washington, D.C., maybe that's interesting, but that's not the information that she needs. And so again, part of the impetus from this was to give state and local policymakers the type of really direct information that they have. You also see these huge differences across cities. And so, for instance, this second chart, it's the same total consumer spending series, except we're showing it to you now in Boston, Detroit, and Philadelphia. Now, I picked those cities because each of them have actually been, pretty heavily affected by the health crisis. Boston was one of the earliest sources of the health outbreak. Philadelphia has been enveloped by kind of the broader effects of the health outbreak coming out of New York City. And Detroit, as you know, was a little bit later breaking, but has had some very high case rates as well. So these three cities have each had reason to be very concerned about this from the health side. But as you see, again, the economic effects are widely varying. So for instance, in Philadelphia, you see the same type of really strong rebound following the stimulus payments that we saw in West Virginia. But in Boston, you see that activity continues to be down really quite a bit. And Detroit has followed kind of a middle path. And so especially across cities, what we're seeing is that it's actually the cities which are a higher income, which are being more sharply affected. And I think, that's somewhat interesting because in every recession that we've seen going back 50 years, unemployment rates have risen faster and total spending has fallen further the poorer cities are or in lower income states. And we're seeing exactly the opposite pattern, at least so far in this recession, which highlights the extent to which both, this is a very different crisis than we've experienced before, but also people need information on what's going on right now. They can't be relying on those old models to be doing the predictions because it really has the potential to lead people quite far astray.
But I want to make sure I understand. We are seeing, aren't we, that lower income workers are being hit harder by unemployment, losing hours, losing wages. But you're saying that even though some of those individual level effects are concentrated among lower income workers, we're seeing wealthier cities that are hit particularly hard at the aggregate level. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the distinction. So what's going on at the individual level is that it's lower income workers that are being hit the hardest. But it's those lower income workers in higher income places. And kind of intuitively, I think what's going on is that it's actually the higher income households that have pulled back most on their spending. It's not just spending, they're the ones who are more likely to be staying at home as well. That's probably because they're a little bit more financially stable. They're able to kind of stay at home. They don't have to go out for their work. Both financially and from a professional perspective, high-income families are much better positioned to weather this shock. But, that's having real consequences for the lower-income workers because when these higher-income families cut back on their spending, it's hitting those small businesses, it's hitting those employees that are often lower income, and they're the ones who now are in danger of not having the money to put food on their table.
And is it your sense that this is the same dynamic that we saw in the 2008 recession or a different one?
Well, again, I think this dynamic is very different because this shock is concentrated initially, at least, among these higher income families in higher income places. In the 2009 recession, and it's the same in all the recessions that were before then, going back all the way to World War II. Again, what you've seen is that unemployment rates have risen faster and spending has fallen further in lower income cities because the economies tend to hold up better in these higher income places. And so what we're seeing right now is in some sense actually the reverse at a local level, even though it's the same thing where we're seeing the larger personal impacts on lower income workers today.
And what is your data saying about what we're seeing in rural areas? Some parts of the country have really not had very high infection rates yet. What's been their level of economic activity?
So we found that the economic activity tends to be less depressed in rural areas. And I think that makes sense where the lower density areas, people probably feel somewhat safer and more able to continue on their normal lives than a pretty dense city. And so it's absolutely the case that we're seeing smaller effects in rural areas. The one caveat that I want to make there, though, is that the variation across, cities versus rural areas, it seems to explain kind of only a small share of the downturn. So, let me put it in other words. urban areas might be down by 25% on average, and rural areas might be down by 15% on average. And so, of course, that's a big difference, but let's not forget that rural areas are still down 15% on average. That is an unbelievably large economic shock. And so I expect to see really serious consequences of this recession everywhere in the country.
So you mentioned that one of the real benefits of the tracker that you created is the ability to see how well different policies are working in real time. So one of the most important decisions that governors have made recently is to shut down their economies, stay-at-home orders, and then we're beginning to see some governors partially reopen their economies. What does your data say about the impact of those decisions?
So I think you're exactly right. This tool is going to allow governors and mayors and policymakers everywhere to understand the impacts of the decisions they're making in near real time, right? We're not going to have to wait 2 months to figure out whether some decision now is having an effect. And I think the most salient example of this, as you mentioned, are the recent reopenings. So for instance, I think Georgia was one of the most well publicized of the reopenings. They started to reopen businesses in the state on April 24th. And what we can do is just look in our tool and see what seems to be going on in economic activity in about the week that follows. And what we've seen is that there's been really very little change in total consumer spending. You can also see in this chart, there's been very little change in the employment that we're seeing at small businesses. Now, you know, as you see for the employment series, right, it's trending up a little bit, but it was already trending up before Georgia reopened, and in some sense, it just seems to be following the trajectory that it was before. So, what are we learning from this? What we're learning is that you know, I think the instinct to want to reopen the economy is exactly right. We need to get the economy back going, kind of at some point. But just declaring the economy open doesn't seem right now to be getting the job done, because people, even though they now can go outside, they don't want to. And it's not just that we see these reopening orders not having an effect. If we go back to when states like Georgia closed down at the beginning of April, if you look at in the same chart a little bit to the left, you see that total consumer spending and small business employment had fallen off long before the stay-at-home order went into place. And so what that really shows is that people are staying at home, not because the governor told them to, but because they're afraid of going outside. They really don't want to get this disease. And so I think, you know, that's, you know, I'm not an epidemiologist. And so, you know, whether it's better testing or contract tracing or social distancing, you know, I'm not the best person to tell you exactly which mix of those is going to work. But I think we're going to need to address this crisis on the health side in order to give people confidence to come back outside of their house and want to re-engage in their normal lives.
Your data is saying what many people are saying is that you're not seeing a sharp trade-off between public health and the economy. The two are going together here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, there may come a time where there is a trade-off, but at the moment, I think most households seem to be just acting cautiously. I think there's a lot of risks that we know, and honestly, there are a lot of risks that we don't know. And so, you know, we need to give people more confidence that they are able to come outside and resume their normal lives without a serious risk of getting sick. And I think certainly in the short term, you know, that's a much, much more important thing than trying to do some health versus economic trade-off. Again, we may come to that at some point, and, you know, there are hard decisions will have to be made. But for the moment, that doesn't seem like it's really a critical thing.
So I think one of the things that makes the crisis so difficult for families, for consumers, for businesses is uncertainty. People just don't know how long this downturn is going to last. Do you have a sense from your data about the likely speed of the recovery? Can you give us any sense of whether we're likely to have a relatively quick upturn, or are we going to be in this situation for many months to come?
So I think you're right. There's a great deal of uncertainty. And exactly because we don't know how the health conditions are going to evolve and how people's fears about the health conditions are going to evolve, I think that's kind of a key determinant that you need to know really before making any strong economic prediction. What our data do say, though, is that businesses, when they're thinking about hiring, and they seem to be now adapting to a new reality where this may really be lasting for quite some time. So another variable that we have in our tracker are job postings. Job postings in the past have been shown to be a, both somewhat of a forward-looking measure of unemployment in the economy, because businesses are planning ahead about who they're going to hire, say, over the next month or two in order to support their business. But also just from a practical perspective, right, we have all these people who are now unemployed. If they're going to get rehired, businesses need to have open jobs into which they can go. And so if businesses aren't hiring, that's going to make the recovery very difficult. So what we saw in job postings is that they actually didn't quite fall off as quickly as consumer spending did in the middle of March. And I think that may have been because some businesses may have thought that this might be something that would pass pretty quickly. Maybe we'd all be at home for 2 or 3 weeks, and then we kind of jump back up and get going again in the middle of April. The president talked about Easter as a potential reopening. And obviously, since then, it's become clear that we may not know exactly when we're going to reopen, but things are not moving super fast. And even when we do reopen, there may be many limitations in place that prevent businesses from resuming full service activities, both from a legal perspective and also that consumers don't want to engage. And so we've seen in the last month, job postings have fallen off really quite sharply. They're down about 40% since the pre-crisis level now. And so I think that's very concerning. This is also something we've seen, of course, in the leisure and hospitality industry, where you'd expect things to be down a lot, in the travel industry as well. That's been down a lot. But we're also seeing reduced job postings in industries like construction or professional services in a way that really suggests that this is going to be a much broader recession. It's going to hit firms much more broadly than just that immediate hit on the leisure and travel businesses.
Mm. What was the most difficult part of creating this tool? I mean, I think it's extremely exciting, extremely timely, clearly going to be a great resource for policymakers. What were some of the obstacles that you had to overcome in pulling all of this together?
So I think that convincing firms to give us the data initially was a big obstacle. And due to the public-mindedness of firms, I think we were able to figure out a way to do that. But even once we got the data, I think this type of data present a different set of challenges than the normal economic data we're used to working with. So government surveys are done in a way that's kind of randomly sampled and specifically designed to be representative, and all those things which are very important. And our data are not like that. We are getting the information on the customers or the clients of whatever businesses and financial intermediaries we're partnering with. And so it's very important for us to, one, make sure that the data patterns we're seeing are representative and that they line up, at least to the extent that we can measure them with past government statistics to get a sense, both are we presenting a representative picture, or are we not? And that's something that we want to be as transparent as possible about. Even to say if we're missing a sector, I think the agriculture industry is a very, very important industry for this country, but that's not something that we have a great deal of data on. And so we just want to be transparent about the fact that we're capturing some things and we're not capturing other things. But we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. We want to try to get the information that we have out there into the public. Another thing that arises in this type of case is that you need to make sure that the movements you see reflect underlying trends in the economy and not just, particular business decisions from one firm. And so, for instance, if a firm decides to, add a big bank as a client in one state, and maybe it looks like transactions in that state jump up a lot, but that's just because there's another bank in that state. And so it took a lot of work to go through and really kind of vet all these series. And, honestly, that's something that's kind of ongoing as we continue to refine this and provide data at more granular levels. That's why being part of the great team at Opportunity Insights, it really was something that was an incredible team effort to dive into these data series in as granular a way as we did, and then kind of try to produce what we thought were the most representative data that we could.
So just to give people a sense, because sometimes I think people see these big data projects, they don't really have a sense of how things go behind the scenes. Around how many people, are on your team that we're working to pull this all together? How large an operation is this?
So there are about 25 people on the team who are working with the data. And then there are a number of others in the background as well who are, helping with the data use agreements, helping to craft documents for policymakers, helping do outreach, helping manage all of this. So in all, I think there are probably 40 people who are working together to help create this over the last month. So, it's something that came together incredibly quickly because, 2 months ago, it wasn't clear that we were going to need something like this as badly as I think we do now. But it was really incredible to see everyone pull together to be able to produce something like this in the last month.
That's great. So where are you going from here? What are your next steps for this project?
So I think the first thing that we want to do is really help flesh out the data that we have there to be able to make more accurate statements about more counties across the country. 10% of consumer spending, I think, is a good amount, certainly at the national level and even to measure what's going on at the state level. But when you get down to the county level, on average, 10% would be fine. But of course, you don't have exactly 10% in all counties. It's going to be higher in some places and lower in other places. And so as a result, we're not able to provide the most kind of granular information that we can. And so continuing to add data partners where we can just make sure that we're providing data in even more places. You'll see on the tool at the moment that, a number of especially small counties have missing data. Those are places where at the moment we just don't feel like we have an accurate picture. But as we continue to add data series, that map will fill in and we'll have a better picture of what's going on across the country. Of course, we're also getting new data every day. And so you'll be able to see the economy, hopefully as it starts to recover. But even if it doesn't, you'll be able to see what's going on in real time. The other thing we're doing is as we bring in new partners, we're going to be able to flesh out what's going on from different dimensions. So for instance, and we've talked about this a little bit, total consumer spending is a combination of spending from lots of different families. And I think one concern is that maybe high-income consumers are cutting back on their spending in a way that's okay. They're not spending as much because they don't have to go outside, but low-income consumers may be forced to cut back on their spending in a way that's a much more serious thing where they just don't have the money to put food on their tables. And so one example of what we're doing is we'll be able to develop a low-income and a high-income consumer series, again, both nationally and in all these counties and cities across the country, to really be able to start to get an even more granular picture of which folks are suffering and where that is. As we saw, the stimulus payments did have an impressive effect on the economy pretty immediately after they came out. But we know from lots of past research that lower income households, exactly because they are very liquidity constrained, often spend stimulus checks or tax refunds very quickly. And it's not that they're being frivolous with the money, it's that they need the money. And so at some point, we're going to need to figure out when the stimulus payment has run out from the perspective of supporting these household budgets, and when we're going to need to start supporting these households again. The same thing on the business side. We're going to need to understand not just where business revenues are still low, but also which businesses are suffering from a balance sheet perspective, where bankruptcies are starting to creep up, where credit is or is not available. These types of things are going to be really important as we understand how business is going to persevere through this recession and be able to come out again on the other side.
Great. So we will get through this crisis. I'm sure it may take some years, but I guess let me ask you to think about our policy system more generally. What do you think that the data system for gauging the economy should look like in 5-10 years? Should we see the government change the way it collects data? You mentioned in the beginning that your project was in some ways filling in the gap, that ongoing studies are too slow, fall behind the curve. And it's a great service, a great public service that your team is beginning to provide real-time data. But is our existing data infrastructure ready for the 21st century, or do you think that the government itself needs to rethink about how it gathers data to understand the state of the economy?
I do think we need to rethink the way that government statistics and data collection works. But I think the good news is both we've seen examples of government statistics changing in the past to reflect new availability of big data. And also I think the data exists now, even in a much broader way than we've been able to tap into for something like this. And so I do hope that our tracker becomes kind of an early model for how these new statistics can work. So let me give you a few examples. So one success story is actually how the census measures incomes. So the traditional way that the census worked was that, say back in 2000, everybody, of course, gets a census form, but about 1 out of every 6 households got a much more detailed form where they had to report not only just who was living in their house, but also they were asked to report a bunch more detailed information about their incomes or their household structure or other things like that. And what they have more recently done is figured out that, of course, asking people, what they earned last year, is a pretty inefficient way of figuring out what they earned, given that we have great tax records that have, very carefully vetted information, not just on 1 out of every 6 households, but really all the households. And so the Census Bureau now, when it produces what's now become the updated version of those long-form censuses called the American Community Survey, they no longer ask people about their incomes. They pull incomes directly from so-called administrative data sources so that it's a much more complete and it's a much more accurate measure of what's going on in the economy. Asking people was leading to something like 1 out of every 3 incomes that supposedly appeared in the survey were actually not incomes that a household answered. They were so-called imputed data, where the government researchers had to make a guess about what should have been the income because the family either didn't answer the question or they didn't answer it in a way that seemed reliable. And so that's one, I think, great success story about how government surveys are adapting to new data sources. But I think we still have a long way to go. And so let me just give you another example of this. As many of you may know, it's not just that the Labor Department puts out this number, but there are a number of private payroll firms. I think ADP, the big payroll firm, is the most prominent among them. They put out 2 days before the Labor Department their own estimate of what the employment situation is. But because people are so focused on this employment number from the Labor Department, and remember, that's telling you what was going on a month ago, ADP, even though they have much more up-to-date data, they still put out a number to try to match the month-old number from the Labor Department. And of course, that's just silly, right? There's, I understand from like an investment perspective, if you're trying to understand whether the stock market is going to go up or down, you want to be able to get that number a couple days early. But I think if we can all just take a step back and realize that projecting some government number isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is just understanding what's going on in the world today. Let's get the most accurate information and the most up-to-date information. Then I think in terms of employment, in terms of consumer spending, in terms of business revenue, all of these things are happening electronically these days in a way that the information is out there. We just need to pull it together in the right way. And so I do really hope that, not just for measuring recessions, but you can imagine all sorts of different contexts where having real-time information on the economy would be useful. So for instance, the next time a big hurricane hits, we need to know what's happening with consumer spending and what's happening with employment, understand how we need to respond economically. The next time a big winter storm hits or there's a big factory layoff, you might want to know what's going on locally in a way that those national statistics aren't going to work. If there's a big local factory, every place else might be fine, but there may be a kind of a small local mini recession that you need to deal with. So I really do think that this is the start of a new paradigm, and I hope that we can convince others to join us in producing real-time statistics just like this.
So it's exciting. Faster data, more accurate data, more granular, a better picture of what's really happening in the lives of citizens and consumers and families and businesses. For people that want to learn more about this project, what's the best place for them to look? Is it the Opportunity Insights website? Where should they go for more information?
So our tracker is on the Opportunity Insights website, but we also just have the link tracktherecovery.org. So if you just go there, again, that's tracktherecovery.org, you'll be led straight to our tracker. And in addition to just the data, we have all sorts of materials about the underlying data sources and their representativeness and coverage. We have information about different examples for how policymakers can use this. And we also have information for other companies that might want to kind of join our partnership and help provide data to support this effort. So there's a lot of information there. I encourage you to go online and check it out.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John. It was great to talk to you today about this important project.
Well, thanks for having me, Eric.